All right, good evening, class. What we're going to talk about today is basically communication in a nutshell. And we're going to take the most complex concepts of communication and we're going to try to break them down into layman's terms. That way, more can understand what's exactly going on during human communication. Now, in order to talk about human communication, we first have to recognize what communication is. Now, communication is defined as the process in which meaning or feeling is made by sending and receiving not only verbal but nonverbal or written symbols and signs that are influenced by multiple choices. And what that means is that it contexts the way that we use words, sounds, signs, and even certain behaviors to express or exchange, certain information towards each other. But communication wasn't always as complex as it has been today. We have far surpassed where we thought we would be a million years ago, where we are now with our communication and our smartphones and tablets and things of that nature. We can call each other, and we're no more than seconds away from someone who's completely across the world. But before then, in the very beginning of times, things were more so done through onomatopoeic gestures and sounds, such as whoosh and swoop and things of that nature to try to communicate what exactly was going on or something that had happened beforehand. Things then moved to a little bit more complex method of sending message through Morse code and telegrams and things of that nature. Now we have fax machines and even more advanced than that, telephone, radio, the internet, email, things like that. So we've definitely come an extremely long way from cave drawings to our iPhones. And when we speak, I like to say that we speak in context and we speak according to the occasion that we're in. And so there are three different types of speaking occasions and types. We have deliberative, which is the purpose is where you want to shape the behavior of someone, something, or someone in the future. So a lot of times this is used in courtrooms and things of that nature to try to influence how something's going to act in the future, where certain legislation is made. Next, we have forensic. In this type of speech, the purpose is to judge what's going on in the present. Now, a lot of times this happens in courtrooms, just like deliberative, but the difference is deliberative is more so like a congressional setting, whereas forensic is more so courtrooms where judgments are being made, sentences are being passed out, and things of that nature. Next, we have epidemic, which is where the purpose is to celebrate or disparage the past. Now, a lot of times you have to be extremely sensitive when you're using this type of speech, and that is because they're used at funerals a lot, where you're trying to move past something that has happened, whether it be the loss of a loved one or whatever have you. Now we're going to focus on the different types of communication. You could break down communication into a number of different types. There are various different categories that you can place communication in, but what we're going to talk about is these 5 types: intrapersonal, interpersonal, group, public, and mass communication. Intrapersonal, not to be confused with interpersonal, is typically between 2 people, and it's known as self-talk. So the type of talking that you do to yourself in your head when you're talking yourself through something, or you're trying to figure out whether or not this is a good decision, that would be considered intrapersonal communication. Now, moving on to interpersonal, this is also called dyadic or dyad communication. It's normally between 2 people, and it can be used to establish and maintain our personal types of relationships. Next, we have group communication, and this is generally between 3 to 25 people, and often groups are created to finish a task and achieve a goal at a much quicker rate or derive at a certain solution faster than you normally would individually. These groups can be long-standing, they can be short, they can be for a certain purpose, or they could just be to conquer a number of different things. It's all up to you. Next, we have public communication, and it's also known as public speaking in some situations, and it's a less interactive type of speech. And what I mean by that is there's a lot less feedback than in some of the other speech categories. So when somebody is giving a speech, for instance, say you're in your school and you're in your school auditorium listening to somebody give a speech about, who knows, binomial nomenclature, let's just say. There is a lot less feedback that you're giving to that person versus you just more so listening to what they're saying and taking it in. And if you have any questions, you may get an opportunity to ask them at the end. Next, we're going to move on to mass communication. And a lot of times you see mass communication through print or through electronic media, but there's definitely no immediate feedback. Like with public communication, there was limited feedback. However, with mass communication, you don't look at a newspaper and say, oh, gee golly, I wish I could go talk to the guy who made this newspaper because I want to tell him how I feel about the article. You may do that, but you don't get immediate feedback. That stuff takes time. You have to take time to communicate with that person, to reach out to them. And it's nowhere near something as close as interpersonal or even a group setting. Next, we want to talk about the models of communication. And these are basically just ways that we use to describe how humans communicate in general and how this whole human communication thing works. First, we have the transmission model. And this is definitely one of the most basic out of the three types of communication models. And I say that because it's considered more so of a one-way communication, where a sender encodes a message and transmits it, the receiver decodes the message, and it stops just right there. There's no room for the receiver to give some feedback, and there's no room for the sender to respond to that receiver's feedback because it's just a one-way type of message. Now, another issue with this is that 9 times out of 10, the transmission can sometimes be distorted to where you can't hear the message or you can't understand clearly exactly what was said. Now, things like this can happen due to environmental issues like storms or even semantic noise like radio feedback or static shock that happens in the radio. So that's one of the reasons why this is considered the oldest and the most primitive form of communication model. Next, we want to move on to the interaction model. And this is considered two-way communication, so it's a little bit more sophisticated than the transmission model, and it leaves room for participants to alternate back and forth between sender and receiver positions. So there's definitely room for some feedback for the sender to give his feedback to the message and the receiver to also give his back to the sender. Now, however, this method does not account for how cultural and social contexts influence our communication. So there's no room for somebody in Japan to communicate with someone in America using this model. And last, we want to move on to the transaction model. And this model is a lot more complex than the previous models that we talked about. And the picture definitely doesn't do it as much justice. There's not room for us to talk about how communication constructs our realities and communities and cultural differences, as well as social differences and things of that nature. Now, in this model, participants are simultaneously senders and receivers, so they're constantly giving each other feedback and constantly sending messages back and forth to each other. Now, like I said previously, this method versus the interaction method accounts for how communication constructs our realities and our communities. So it accounts for how we're building these personal relationships and these group relationships with each other in the community. Now, we're going to go over some principles of communication. And I like to call them more so statements of communication than anything else because that's mostly exactly what they are. They are stating something and they have specific purposes. Now, the first one, communication is unescapable. And I say this because we are always communicating, even when we're doing it with ourselves. We are constantly throughout the day communicating, constantly. And communication is not only through words, but can be verbal and nonverbal as well. So things such as eye contact, tone of voice, posture, everything you do is sending a message to someone, even if it's just yourself. Next, we want to talk about how communication is irreversible. Once we say something, there's no way you can take it back, no matter how hard you try. Those words are always going to be in the air. They're always going to be somewhere online. They're always going to be in someone's ear. There is physically no way to get those words back. So you have to be very mindful of what you say in certain settings. And the third, communication is complicated. Consider all the challenges that you encounter trying to communicate with someone on a daily basis. You have to think about things like different experiences that you may have or things that you might have shared in the past. You have to think about the language barriers that you're talking about, the regional differences, the cultural differences. All of these can affect how we communicate with each other in certain settings. And number 4, communication is symbolic. Now, we talked about this previously on the second slide where we showed the pictures and the images of how communication evolved. Think about how the cavemen communicated with each other with the onomatopoeic gestures and the cave paintings. We have, since the beginning of time, used symbols to communicate with